This is the story of Haile Mariam Mengistu, the dictator from Ethiopia, who was a popular army officer and was installed as the ruler of Ethiopia following the country's 1974 revolution, which led to the overthrow of the Emperor Haile Selassie. Mengistu remained in power for the next 17 years, and his attempt to mold the country into a Soviet-style socialist paradise plunged it into a brutal reign of terror instead. Mengistu's government-sanctioned campaign of political repression between 1976 to 1978 resulted in more than 10,000 deaths. This campaign of political repression became known as the Red Terror, and Mengistu gained the title of the Butcher of Addis Ababa. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the reign of Ethiopia's dictator, Mengistu Haile Mariam. Ethiopia's history has been a turbulent and brutal one. Never colonized by the European powers, the country was ruled by emperors until 1974, and the ethnically diverse feudal society was often characterized by regional, territorial, and religious discord. Emperor Haile Selassie was the leader of the country and the last emperor of Ethiopia. His rule in Ethiopia continued until 1974, at which time famine, worsening unemployment, and the political stagnation of his government prompted segments of the army to mutiny. By early 1974, strikes, protests, and demonstrations against the imperial government were staged throughout the country by many different groups, including students and a wide range of Marxist intellectuals, taxi drivers, labor unions, and military units. The government's unwillingness or inability to respond to these demands eventually led to the overthrow of the Emperor Haile Selassie and the ascension to power of the Provisional Military Administrative Committee, also known as the DIRG. The DIRG was established in June 1974 as the coordinating committee of the Armed Forces, Police and Territorial Army by officers of the Ethiopian Army and Police, and they were led initially by the chairman Aman Andom. The subject of this video, Mengistu Haile Mariam, later became the chairman of the DIRG, and after the arrest of the Emperor Haile Selassie in September of 1974, Mengistu was made a vice chairman of the Provisional Military Administrative Council, which was run by the DIRG and which assumed the functions of government. On November 23, 1974, Mengistu ordered the assassination of the PMAC's moderate chairman and urged the killing of 60 aristocrats and former officials of the old imperial regime. The DIRG abolished the monarchy and established Ethiopia as a Marxist-Leninist one-party state, with itself as the vanguard party in a provisional government. By killing selected enemies within the DIRG, Mengistu became the acknowledged strongman of a regime that would proceed to nationalize industries and farmlands. But before we look at Mengistu's reign of terror that would follow after the DIRG took control, let's quickly look at his background. Mengistu Haile Mariam was born in 1937 in Walaita, a district in the southern part of Ethiopia, and his father was a soldier in the Ethiopian army. His mother was a domestic worker and may have brought him to live with her in a well-connected household in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, where she had taken a job. Darker-skinned Ethiopians like himself, however, had long been discriminated against by Ethiopia's elite, and this prejudice may have been the basis for some of his later punitive acts as a leader. As a young man, Mengistu enlisted in the Ethiopian army and then trained at the Holeta Military Academy. He graduated in 1966 with the rank of second lieutenant, and in the 1960s, he was one of the 4,000 Ethiopian military personnel that were sent to the United States for advanced military training. After returning to Ethiopia, Mengistu rose quickly through the army's ranks, becoming a major by 1974, and had developed effective leadership skills which made him popular among his fellow junior officers. These talents proved important in his rise to the top of Ethiopia's military government in the political vacuum that followed the 1974 revolution. Mengistu despised the rich and the well-born elite that surrounded the emperor, Haile Selassie. After the 1974 revolution, Mengistu emerged as one of the most effective and the most ruthless in the DIRG-run military government. The DIRG imposed some changes in Ethiopia in some quick succession. By December 1974, the advent of Ethiopian socialism was proclaimed. Under the DIRG and Mengistu's leadership, the military government of Socialist Ethiopia made a number of social and economic reforms, including a major land reform in 1975 and large-scale nationalization of foreign-owned banks, factories, insurance companies, and agricultural projects. To spread this message and his ideology to rural Ethiopia, the Derg and Mengistu dispatched the entire body of 50,000 secondary school students, university graduates, and teachers into the countryside. By 1976, Mengistu had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he also remained as head of the Derg, and then he went on to seize power more firmly in February of 1977 when he became the commander-in-chief of the Ethiopian Armed Forces. 2 months later, Mengistu spoke at a rally and promised that all enemies of Ethiopia's historic 1974 revolution would be brought to justice, and he went on to smash bottles that he claimed were filled with blood to emphasize his point. Following on from this, the Derg itself was split between rival factions. Mengistu was part of a faction that demanded uncompromising action against the Derg's opponents, while other officers favored a more conciliatory approach. At a meeting of the Derg at the Grand Palace on 3 February 1977, Mengistu and his supporters suddenly left the room, leaving behind 7 members he considered his enemies. Mengistu's bodyguards stormed into the room with machine guns and forced his enemies down the basement. He later joined them in the basement and also joined in the executions of his enemies. He was now firmly in control. He next turned ruthlessly against his civilian opponents, embarking on what he referred to as a campaign of Red Terror, licensing civilian groups to act on his behalf. He would tell his supporters that it is an historical obligation to clean up vigilantly using the revolutionary sword. Your struggle should be demonstrated by spreading Red Terror in the camp of the reactionaries. So during 1977 and 1978, the military government withstood a major challenge from radical students and bureaucrats during the period known as the Red Terror. The Ethiopian Red Terror of 1976, or others say from 1977 to 1978, began with that speech by Mengistu where he smashed bottles that he claimed were filled with blood. This Red Terror was a campaign of urban counter-insurgency waged in the main cities of Ethiopia, notably Addis Ababa. The name Red Terror was officially used by Mengistu's government, and this name accurately reflects the way in which excessive violence was used to terrify the population. Hundreds of suspected enemies of the regime were arrested, detained without trial, tortured, and even killed. The victims were primarily university students and bureaucrats who had voiced dissatisfaction with the pace of Mengistu's Soviet-style revolution. Some elements of the Red Terror were borrowed from Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in China that began a decade earlier, following a well-defined plan of action to find, punish, and reverse what was deemed as the bourgeoisie and therefore people of counter-revolutionary thought. Many young Ethiopians were killed and imprisoned when the struggle of power between civilian and military factions erupted on the streets of the capital. Mengistu ordered arms to be distributed to defense squads formed by urban neighborhood associations, or kebeles as they were called. Months of urban warfare, assassination, and indiscriminate killing followed. A significant minority of those killed or detained during the mid-1970s were traders and shopkeepers. This group, and in particular grain traders, were targets of the new government from 1975. Grain merchants were blamed in part for the famines of 1972 to 1974 and seen as class enemies of the revolution. Many large merchants fled Ethiopia when the radical political leanings of the Derg became clear, or they even joined one of the conservative political military resistance movements, such as the Ethiopian Democratic Union, which was militarily active in the provinces of Tigray and Gondar. The Red Terror was one of the most systematic uses of mass murder by the state ever witnessed in Africa. The number of those who died in the Red Terror is not known, but it is certainly well in excess of 10,000 people. Despite his strongman tactics and excessive use of force, Mengistu's hold over other parts of Ethiopia was nevertheless precarious. By mid-1977, the Ethiopian army in Eritrea lost most major towns and controlled little more than Asmara and the ports of Massawa and Assab in Eritrea. In July of 1977, Somalia, deciding that the time was ripe to take advantage of the Derg's preoccupation with Eritrea and other revolts, decided to launch an offensive against Ethiopia. when the United States refused to ship arms to the Ethiopian government to defend its eastern front with Somalia, Mengistu and the Ethiopian government turned to the former Soviet Union as their source of military hardware and political advice. The massive intervention by the Soviet Union as well as Cuban forces rescued Mengistu from military defeat by Somalia. Between 1977 and 1990, Soviet military assistance to Ethiopia was estimated to be as much as $13 billion. Internally in Ethiopia, Mengistu called for the collectivization of agriculture along Soviet lines and continued to push for a military solution to the problem of Eritrea, a former Italian colony and the province of Ethiopia in which rebels had been fighting for independence since 1962. As the undisputed ruler of the country, Mengistu oversaw the establishment of the Workers' Party of Ethiopia in 1984, as well as the drafting of a new constitution in 1986. On September 10, 1987, Mengistu became a civilian president under the new constitution, and the country was renamed the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. During this wartime, his government was faced with enormous difficulties throughout the 1980s in the form of droughts and widespread famine, notably the Ethiopian famine of 1984 to 1985. While Mengistu was captivated and preoccupied by the details of the 10th anniversary of the Derg taking power, Ethiopia was headed for its greatest disaster of the 20th century, which was the famine of 1984. Forewarned of catastrophe, Mengistu was determined that nothing would be allowed to get in the way of his celebrations. For months, he refused to give the matter any attention. On his orders, relief efforts were obstructed. No mention was made during the celebration of the masses that were starving to death north of the capital. When news of the disaster subsequently emerged, it was to inspire an extraordinary surge of compassion and generosity from people and governments around the world. What was not realized at the time was the extent to which the disaster had been caused by Mengistu's own counterinsurgency wars that he was determined to prosecute even when the full scale of starvation became clear. Between 1982 and 1992, 2 million people died in Ethiopia due to a combination of war and famine. Many more people became refugees, further destabilizing social and political relations with Ethiopia's neighboring countries. This series of the worst droughts and famines ever to afflict Ethiopia, as well as an agricultural economy ruined by the forced collectivization of farms and the relocation of entire populations, would sow the seeds of what would be Mengistu's eventual downfall. During Mengistu's time in power, there had been insurrections, particularly in the northern regions of Tigray and Eritrea. In 1989, the Tigray People's Liberation Front merged with other ethnically based opposition movements to form the Ethiopia's People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF. In May of 1991, the EPRDF forces would advance on the capital Addis Ababa. These forces would successfully topple Mengistu's government. This also coincided with the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. The withdrawal of Soviet support had weakened Mengistu's power. He would flee the country of Ethiopia with 50 family members as well as some members of the Derg, and he was soon granted asylum in Zimbabwe as an official guest of Robert Mugabe, who was the president of that country. Mengistu left behind almost the entire membership of the original Derg and the Workers' Party of Ethiopia leadership, which was promptly arrested and put on trial upon the assumption of power by the EPRDF. The trial against Mengistu started in 1994, and in January 2007, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for genocide. However, Ethiopia has unsuccessfully attempted to extradite him. On May 26, 2008, Mengistu was sentenced to death in absentia by the Ethiopian High Court, overturning his sentence of life imprisonment. He remains in exile in Harare, Zimbabwe. Mengistu's time in power undermined the fundamental rights of Ethiopians to freely determine their political status and pursue economic, social, and cultural development. Many lives were lost and many people fled the country of Ethiopia. Mengistu Haile Mariam's story helps to explain some aspects of Ethiopia's current state, and hopefully this video helped put this point across. Let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are on Mengistu's time in power. Don't forget to like and share the video if you found it insightful. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.